Hi, and welcome to my multimedia presentation. My name is Chloe Anderton, and let's get started. So the main question that we were tasked with defining is the difference between intellectual performance and adaptive behaviors and how they work together in the diagnosis of a child with an intellectual disability. So first I went ahead and gave some definitions. So intellectual performance is described as a general mental capacity. Areas of mental capacity include planning, resolving issues, and understanding multifaceted ideas, amongst other areas. And so, adaptive behaviors is defined as the collection of conceptual, social, and practical skills learned by people to enable them to function in their everyday lives. So, what this means is that in general, intellectual performance has more to do with the academic performance of a student and whether or not they're able to perform on task with their peers in a classroom setting, and adaptive behaviors has more to do with general abilities that help a child get through their daily lives, like being able to get dressed in the morning, be able to cook for themselves, to clean up their area, to be able to brush their teeth, brush their hair, and certain things that may come more naturally to a student without an intellectual disability versus with. So the first I want to go into detail with is the intellectual performance side of an intellectual disability diagnosis. So intellectual performance is how we measure a child's academic performance to others and determine if an intellectual disability is the cause of an issue with a student's academics. In order to be defined as having an intellectual disability, the student must show significantly low academic performance compared to their peers. And actually, when defined by IDEA, the issue for in order for a student to be defined as having an intellectual disability, they must show that they are at least 2 standard deviations away from the norm in all subject areas. So a student must struggle in all content areas to be able to be defined as having an intellectual disability, and otherwise it might just be a reading disability or a disability in a certain content area, but not necessarily an intellectual disability, which is a completely different diagnosis and issue for a student to struggle with. And so the consideration of a student's intellectual performance is a key step to getting the diagnosis of having an intellectual disability, which will help the student when it comes to getting the assistance they need. So without measuring the intellectual performance of a child, you probably will not be able to properly quantify whether or not a student has an intellectual disability. But intellectual performance is not the only part of diagnosing a child with an intellectual disability. Another key part to keep in mind is their adaptive behaviors. Analyzing a student's adaptive behavior skills is just as important as knowing their intellectual performance. Being able to get dressed in the morning is every bit as important to the education of a child as their ability to solve a math equation or read a sentence. This also goes into just behavior in general. Working on the behavior of a child is just as important as working on their academics, which is why adaptive behaviors and knowing a child's skills is just as important as knowing their academic skills in defining them as having an intellectual disability. It is also just as important to identify in the case of students with intellectual disabilities, as that disability does not just affect the student's academics, but also their ability to learn basic tasks for themselves. So this means that in terms of intellectual disabilities, adaptive behaviors are half of the key to determining whether a student has an intellectual disability. So, of course, adaptive behaviors cannot be quantified in the same manner that an academic issue might be able to. So, while traditional tests are not how adaptive behaviors are measured, there are many options when it comes to the assessment of those skills. The top 3 would be observations and interviews, and then also questionnaires when it comes to teachers are highly suggested, as the skills in question are not quantifiable. You can't place a number or a rating on how well a student completes the task of brushing their teeth. The skills are in question are kind of all or nothing. Can they brush their teeth? So, therefore, the assessor must rely on experiences documented by teachers, parents, and even the student themselves. This means that while you can observe a student performing those behaviors, the person who is going to know the most about whether or not a student is able to complete the certain adaptive behaviors that you're wanting to ask about is going to be the people who are actually around the student, like their parents, their teachers, or if they're able to talk about themselves, then also themselves. So, another issue that we were tasked with talking about is the issue of language and culture in the world of special needs children. So, the experience of students with disabilities is often very similar to students who learn English as a second language for many reasons. Um, there are two reasons or two categories for students who may be misidentified either way. One is called underrepresentation and the other is overrepresentation. So these following reasons are more of the overrepresentation reasons of why a student might be misidentified as having an intellectual disability while not actually having said disability. So, firstly, teachers often misidentify the symptoms of having an English language learner, or ELL, as signs of an intellectual disability. So, what this means is that teachers might see a child who is struggling in reading and writing and assume that it is because they have an intellectual disability, when in fact it is because they are an English language learner. Secondly, a teacher may misinterpret a student's cultural norms as signs of a behavioral disorder. So, students who may come from a different background than the teacher might have different ways of showing respect, different ways of interacting with classmates or of behaving in class, and a teacher might misinterpret those cultural disconnect as more of a child acting out and may have having a behavioral disorder or as an intellectual disability of being unable to understand certain classroom rules. So the teacher might overrepresent them as children with disabilities rather than just children who come from a different cultural background than the teacher. So I am far from an expert, so I found a semi expert to be able to explain to you the concept of underrepresentation.
I think the challenge in identifying English language learners with disabilities is that when we look at this population, we tend to see widespread underachievement, high rates of retention, high rates of school attrition, and over-identification as students who need remediation or who have disabilities. I think the issue for educators is that when you look at English language learners, particularly as they begin to acquire English, and you look at students with language and learning disabilities, their characteristics are virtually the same. And so it's very difficult to tell when you're looking at a linguistic or cultural difference versus when you're looking at a disability. And so when you look at underrepresentation, for example, one of the things that happens is that educators attribute learning problems to the fact that children are in the process of acquiring English or because they reflect different cultural behaviors. And so they don't even consider the possibility that the student might have a disability. So you get under referral, waiting for children to acquire enough English so that then we can do assessments and have more confidence that we've identified a student accurately. Another is that schools oftentimes put into place informal policies, such as you can't refer an English language learner until they've been in the system for 2 or 3 years. And so teachers are actually discouraged from making referrals, even though they may feel that the student's learning problems are so different from peers that they need more help than they can provide in the context of the general education classroom. So discouraging referrals contributes to under-identification. There's also an inaccurate or a misconception in many school districts that you can't serve English language learners in special education programs at the same time.
So those are the general rule or reasons that a child might be underrepresented as a child with a disability. So How can we help English language learners in these areas? So, the easiest way to determine if a cultural linguistic issue is the cause of an academic performance not meeting the standard is to to know your students and their culture. Interviewing the family, speaking to the child about their norms is a good way to get an understanding of what their individual culture may be. So, what this means is that the biggest way to determine why a student is acting a certain way is to get to know them. So, if you think that a child might be struggling because they might not understand English properly, then maybe get to know their family and see what language is spoken at home. Speak speak to them about maybe how they are going about solving an issue to determine whether or not it's actually an intellectual disability or more of a cultural or language issue. So, the resources for students identified as English language learners are legally protected just as students with special needs. So, while children with special needs might have IDEA, there is a bilingual language learners protection in the state of Texas and also nationally. So the options for education may vary from district to district. As with special education, you may have students who are more, or school districts that are more funded to be able to provide for a lot of students, and you may have districts that struggle to meet the needs of their students. So it varies from district to district, but in terms of being a teacher and ourselves learning how to help students, diversifying instruction based on language ability and individualized tutoring are almost always constants that most teachers can rely on to help English language learners. So, while you yourself might not be able to provide that tutoring, most districts offer either pull-out classes for students, which may or may not be effective, as having a bilingual education program specifically geared for that student, but within your own curriculum, being able to diversify your instruction not only helps students in your classroom who may have a special need, but also children who are learning on a different language basis, to be able to match the content level of their peers, but be supported in a language context. So those are my sources, and thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.